In this hollow, 43 years ago, a poker game between Moonshiners and federal agents ended in gunfire. Two men, an agent and a Dixon brother, never walked out. The debt on the table that night was more than money.
Between September 12th and November 30th, 1963, 21 federal law enforcement officers died during systematic campaign by members of Dixon clan, who'd eliminated everyone responsible for publicly humiliating family patriarch Thomas Dixon during collection of $300 poker debt that had been legitimate obligation, but that agents had used as pretense for ransacking Klan compound in Carter County, Tennessee, collection that had escalated when Agent Marcus Webb had forced 71-year-old Thomas to kneel in mud before grandchildren, while reading a loud written statement admitting he was degenerate gambler who couldn't pay honest debts, and promising to live righteously and obey federal authority. Humiliation that had been compounded when agents had confiscated family Bible that Thomas's grandfather had carried during Civil War, claiming it as collateral until debt was paid, despite Bible having no monetary value, and despite confiscation serving no legitimate collection purpose, but representing deliberate attack on families' religious heritage that mountain culture held sacred. By December 5th, all 21 agents who'd participated in collection operation, or who'd forced Thomas to kneel, or who'd confiscated Bible were dead, their bodies discovered throughout eastern Tennessee, where coordinated actions by multiple Dixon clan members had systematically hunted and killed federal personnel through poisoning methods, demonstrating that when government authority employs public humiliation to enforce debts, and when systems refuse accountability for degrading tactics that violated dignity and that attacked religious heritage, then kinship groups will deliver retribution that institutions decline to provide, even when evidence documented that collection methods had exceeded what legal authority permitted and had violated policies prohibiting unnecessary humiliation during enforcement operations. Carter County, Tennessee, occupied 341 square miles of mountainous terrain in northeastern corner of state in 1963, populated by approximately 48,000 people working in agriculture, coal mining, and manufacturing industries that regional economy supported. Conservative rural area, where extended families often maintained close-knit communities, and where evangelical Christianity was dominant cultural force shaping values and practices that populations considered fundamental to identity and to proper living. The region had been experiencing economic decline during early 1960s, when mechanization of mining and manufacturing had eliminated jobs that families had depended on for generations, circumstances creating financial stresses that made debts difficult to repay, and that made enforcement operations targeting unpaid obligations particularly burdensome for populations whose income sources were disappearing through industrial changes beyond their control. September 1963 meant late summer in Tennessee mountains, where hot weather made outdoor labor difficult, and where preparations for fall harvest were occupying farming families whose livelihoods depended on successful crops that would sustain them through winter months. Month also marked period when Internal Revenue Service was conducting aggressive operations throughout region targeting tax debts and other federal obligations that economic decline had made increasingly difficult for populations to satisfy. Enforcement that communities often viewed as governmental overreach against people who were struggling economically and who needed flexibility rather than aggressive collection tactics that threatened to destroy what little financial stability families had maintained. Dixon clan was extended family group consisting of approximately 53 members, spanning 5 generations from patriarch Thomas Dixon, age 71, down through his children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, and great-great-grandchildren, ranging from infants to adults in their 50s. Family that had lived on 300-acre compound in Carter County since 1840s, when Thomas's great-grandfather had homesteaded land and had begun tradition of keeping family together through maintaining property where multiple households shared resources and where collective decision-making addressed challenges that mountain living created. Thomas had maintained family cohesion through combination of personal authority based on age and experience, through organizing religious services that family held weekly at Compound's Chapel that Thomas's grandfather had built in 1880s, through emphasizing values of mutual support and Christian living that evangelical culture celebrated, creating situation where Dixon clan functioned almost as religious community, with internal governance based partly on scriptural interpretation that Thomas as elder provided, and that family members were expected to follow. Thomas's poker debt had originated in legitimate gambling losses during game held in June 1963 at local establishment where mountain men gathered for recreation, game where Thomas had lost approximately $300 that he'd been unable to pay immediately. Due to economic circumstances that had reduced families' cash income, debt that Thomas had acknowledged was legitimate and that he'd been attempting to repay through making small payments from farming income that sporadic sales of produce generated. Creditor, who'd won money, had been patient initially, but had eventually contacted IRS informing them that Thomas owed gambling debt, contact that had been motivated by creditor's frustration with slow repayment, but that had created federal involvement because gambling winnings were taxable income and because debtors' inability to pay suggested potential tax evasion or other violations that IRS enforcement could investigate. Federal agents' collection operation at Dixon compound had occurred September 11, 1963, when 25 officers led by IRS agent Marcus Webb had arrived claiming they were investigating potential tax violations related to gambling debt and to families' income sources, operation that had been authorized ostensibly to ensure compliance with tax laws, but that had escalated into aggressive collection tactics when Webb had determined that making example of Thomas would demonstrate federal authority and would deter other mountain families from avoiding tax obligations or from engaging in gambling that generated unreported income. Approach to compound had involved agents surrounding property preventing family members from leaving, while Webb and 6 others had entered main house demanding to speak with Thomas about debt and about families' financial records that agents wanted to examine for evidence of unreported income. Confrontation had developed when Thomas had explained that poker debt was being repaid gradually through what limited income farming generated, but that $300 represented significant sum that immediate full payment was impossible when families' economic circumstances were difficult, explanation that Webb had characterized as attempt to avoid legitimate obligations and that Webb had used as justification for conducting thorough search of compound looking for hidden cash or for evidence that family had income sources they weren't reporting to IRS. Search had been unnecessarily destructive, had involved ransacking rooms and throwing belongings onto floors, creating chaos that witnesses described as designed to intimidate, rather than to conduct legitimate investigation that proper methods would have accomplished without gratuitous property damage. Most devastating aspect of collection operation had been Webb's decision to force Thomas to make public statement admitting gambling debt and promising to obey federal authority. Humiliation that had been conducted in compound's courtyard, where approximately 30 family members, including grandchildren, had been gathered and forced to witness as agents, had made Thomas kneel in mud that recent rain had created. Elderly man who had been family's respected patriarch and spiritual leader, reduced to position of supplication before government authority while reading statement that Webb had written characterizing Thomas as degenerate gambler who couldn't pay honest debts, and requiring promise to live righteously and obey federal authority. Forcing elderly patriarch to kneel in mud before family had been profound violation of dignity that mountain culture and evangelical Christianity both emphasized as essential to manhood and to spiritual authority. Humiliation had been designed to break Thomas's standing within family and within broader community, where respect for elders was fundamental value, that proper behavior required maintaining regardless of circumstances. Confiscation of family Bible had compounded humiliation into sacrilege when agents had taken book that Thomas's grandfather had carried during Civil War service with Confederate forces, Bible that contained family records documenting births, marriages, and deaths spanning 5 generations, Bible whose pages included pressed flowers from funerals, and whose margins contained handwritten prayers and scriptural notations that generations of Dixon family members had added throughout decades of use. Webb had claimed Bible as collateral for debt, despite book having no significant monetary value, and despite confiscation serving no legitimate collection purpose when $300 debt wouldn't have justified taking property whose sentimental and religious significance far exceeded any resale value that federal authority could realize. Taking Bible had been calculated attack on families' religious heritage, recognition that Bible represented not merely book, but sacred object whose possession was essential for families' spiritual practices and whose loss would be experienced as profound violation affecting entire clans' religious identity. Thomas had filed formal complaint with IRS on September 12th, explaining that collection operation had employed tactics that served no legitimate enforcement purpose, that forcing him to kneel and read humiliating statement before family had been degrading treatment violating dignity that federal authority should respect even when collecting debts, that confiscating Bible had been attack on religious heritage, serving no collection function when book had no monetary value, making it unsuitable collateral. IRS Supervisor David Mitchell had dismissed complaint, explaining that agents had discretion to employ methods that would ensure compliance and that would demonstrate consequences of avoiding tax obligations. That public acknowledgement of debts and temporary confiscation of property were appropriate tactics when debtors were uncooperative. Characterization that ignored witness testimony, describing Thomas as having been cooperative, and that dismissed religious significance of Bible as irrelevant to collection operations, that property value rather than cultural meaning determined what could be confiscated. Dixon clan's decision to systematically eliminate 21 federal agents who'd participated in collection operation was collective determination made during family meeting held September 12th. Same day, Mitchell had dismissed complaint. Decision represented coordinated response by multiple family members rather than individual vengeance, creating situation where systematic campaign would be executed by several Dixon clan members working cooperatively using knowledge that mountain life and religious community practices had taught about herbs and plants whose properties could kill when administered properly, expertise that had been developed through traditional medicine practices, where knowledge of natural remedies and of toxic substances had been passed through generations of mountain families whose remoteness from medical care had required understanding how to treat illnesses and how to prevent threats using what forests and gardens provided. Method of poisoning had been chosen because multiple family members possessed knowledge of toxic plants through traditional medicine practices and through compounds extensive herb gardens that family maintained for medicinal purposes, knowledge that Dixon clan members applied to identifying substances that would kill efficiently when administered through food or drink, that targets would consume without detecting contamination, that proper preparation would conceal through masking flavors or through using delivery methods that victims wouldn't associate with poisoning. Planning involved identifying agents' routines and locations where food or drink could be accessed, determining which toxic substances would be most effective for causing deaths that might initially appear natural or accidental rather than obviously murders, preparing materials in forms that could be administered discreetly by family members who had access to restaurants or markets where agents regularly obtained food. The systematic elimination began September 12th, when Agent Marcus Webb, who'd forced Thomas to kneel and who'd confiscated Bible, was found dead at his home, killed by poisoning that investigation would determine had been administered through coffee that Webb had purchased at local diner where Dixon family member worked as cook, deadly nightshade extract that had been mixed into beverage in quantities sufficient to cause cardiac arrest within hours of consumption. Webb's death created immediate concern throughout federal law enforcement community, where poisoning as murder method was unusual enough to raise questions about whether death represented natural causes or represented assassination using sophisticated knowledge of toxic substances that rural populations might possess through traditional medicine practices. Deputy Thomas Harrison, who'd been among agents who'd watched Thomas kneel in mud, died September 15th, from similar poisoning administered through meal at restaurant. Aconite that investigation would discover had been added to food causing respiratory failure that had killed Harrison before medical intervention could save him. Harrison's death confirmed pattern when investigators recognized similarities to Webb's poisoning. Realization prompted heightened security for surviving collection operation participants and initiated intensive investigation attempting to identify perpetrators before additional killings occurred. warnings to avoid eating at establishments where Dixon family members might have access to food preparation. Pattern continued throughout September and October, with agents dying through various poisoning methods, including arsenic administered in small doses over days, causing symptoms that mimicked natural illnesses, cyanide delivered through beverages causing rapid deaths, ricin extracted from castor beans producing delayed deaths that initially appeared to be natural illnesses, diverse substances creating uncertainty about specific methods that would be employed and making protection difficult when poisoning could occur through any food or drink that contamination could affect. Deaths demonstrated not only botanical knowledge, but also intelligence gathering about agents' routines and about locations where family members had access to food supplies, allowing administration without being observed. Coordination, suggesting that multiple Dixon clan members were participating in surveillance and in executing poisonings. By November 30th, 21, agents were dead from systematic campaign that had proceeded, despite massive investigation involving FBI, IRS, and Tennessee Bureau of Investigation, deploying hundreds of officers attempting to identify perpetrators and to prevent additional killings. Elimination of all collection operation participants within 12 weeks demonstrated capability and coordination that authorities hadn't anticipated from family group whose religious practices and traditional medicine knowledge had made them seem unlikely sources of sophisticated murder campaign. Investigation had focused quickly on Dixon clan, given obvious motive following Thomas's humiliation and Bible confiscation, but establishing which specific family members had participated in planning or executing poisonings proved difficult when clans' collective loyalty meant that members refused cooperating with authorities, and when forensic evidence linking specific individuals to toxic substance preparation was limited. Breakthrough came when FBI surveillance observed 3 Dixon family members: Samuel Dixon, age 47, who was Thomas's eldest son, Rachel Dixon, age 44, who was Thomas's daughter, and Michael Dixon, age 32, who was Thomas's grandson, accessing storage area at restaurant where one agent regularly ate. Surveillance team intervened, discovering containers of toxic substances and syringes that could be used for injecting poisons into packaged foods, arrests that prevented additional deaths, and that provided physical evidence, including botanical reference books describing toxic plant properties, and lists showing which agents had been eliminated and which remained as targets. Searches of Dixon compound following arrests discovered extensive herb gardens containing plants, including deadly nightshade, aconite, castor beans, whose seeds produced ricin. Evidence demonstrating that systematic campaign had been coordinated effort, involving at minimum 3 family members working cooperatively and possibly involving broader clan participation that prosecution would need to prove. But investigation's most disturbing discovery was evidence suggesting that broader clan participation had extended beyond 3 arrested members. Documents and testimony indicated that other family members had cultivated toxic plants, had provided access to food preparation locations, had maintained surveillance tracking agents' routines, had provided alibis protecting participants, involvement creating questions about how many Dixon clan members bore criminal responsibility for 21 poisonings when prosecution would need to prove specific individuals' roles rather than merely demonstrating that family, as collective entity, had participated in conspiracy. Federal prosecutors determined that sufficient evidence existed to charge Samuel, Rachel, and Michael with 21 murders and with conspiracy, but recognized that proving guilt beyond reasonable doubt would require demonstrating that each defendant had participated in specific poisonings rather than proving only that clan collectively had engaged in systematic campaign. Trial for 21 murders occurred in March 1964 at Federal Courthouse in Knoxville, where 3 Dixon defendants faced prosecution for killing federal law enforcement officers. Case that attracted national media attention, both because poisoning as systematic murder method highlighted traditional medicine knowledge that mountain families possessed, and because prosecution of family group for coordinated violence raised questions about collective responsibility, that religious community dynamics complicated. Prosecution presented overwhelming evidence including toxic substances recovered from defendants when arrested, botanical reference books showing plant properties, surveillance footage documenting defendants accessing food storage, herb gardens at compound containing poisonous plants, systematic pattern proving that 21 deaths represented coordinated campaign rather than isolated incidents. Defense didn't dispute that 3 defendants had participated in planning and executing systematic poisonings, but argued that actions had been desperate response to profound humiliation that forcing Thomas to kneel in mud before family had represented, and to sacrilege that confiscating family Bible had constituted, when religious heritage had been attacked through taking sacred object that generations had valued. Presented evidence documenting Civil War Bible's significance and describing Thomas's standing as spiritual leader whose dignity had been essential for families' religious practices. Defense also emphasized that collection operation had found no evidence of unreported income and that aggressive tactics had served no legitimate enforcement purpose beyond demonstrating federal authority through humiliating patriarch whose poker debt was being repaid gradually through what limited income farming generated. Most dramatic defense evidence came from testimony of religious scholars and mountain culture anthropologists who explained that in evangelical Appalachian communities, spiritual authority depended on maintaining dignity and respect, that forcing elderly patriarch to kneel in mud before family members had been calculated, destruction of religious leadership, that confiscating Bible that contained 5 generations of family records had been experienced as attack on clan spiritual identity rather than as simple property seizure. Experts testified that family Bibles in mountain evangelical culture represented far more than books, but functioned as sacred objects whose possession was essential for religious practices and whose family records made them irreplaceable repositories of genealogical and spiritual heritage that monetary value couldn't capture. But prosecution emphasized that regardless of humiliation's severity and regardless of Bible's significance, systematic assassination of 21 federal officers through sophisticated poisoning methods constituted murder that criminal law prohibited and that couldn't be justified through claiming that family members were avenging patriarch's degradation. That proper response to collection tactics would have been civil litigation seeking damages or continued complaints through administrative channels rather than employing coordinated violence that had killed people who may have had varying degrees of involvement in Thomas's humiliation or in Bible's confiscation. Prosecutors noted that victims had included agents whose participation in collection operation had been peripheral, that some had been present without actively participating in forcing Thomas to kneel, and that killing 21 people for $300 debt collection represented excessive response even when acknowledging that tactics had been degrading and that Bible confiscation had been sacrilegious. Jury deliberated 16 days before returning guilty verdicts against all 3 defendants on all 21 murder counts. Longest jury deliberation in Tennessee, federal court history, reflected unprecedented complexity, evaluating family group responding to religious humiliation, that cultural context made far more significant than urban jurors initially understood. Deliberations that required assessing whether each defendant's specific participation in each poisoning had been proven beyond reasonable doubt, rather than merely establishing that family collectively had engaged in systematic campaign. Jurors explained afterward that they'd been deeply moved by testimony about Thomas's humiliation and had been disturbed by evidence that Bible confiscation had served no legitimate collection purpose. But that systematic nature of poisoning campaign and sophistication, demonstrated through botanical knowledge, had made convictions necessary when overwhelming evidence proved deliberate murders rather than spontaneous violence that humiliation might have partially excused. Judge sentenced each defendant to life imprisonment without parole on multiple counts to be served consecutively, effective life sentences acknowledging severity of killing 21 officers, while noting that religious and cultural context created mitigation that death penalty consideration had rejected. Sentencing created controversies when religious freedom advocates and mountain culture preservation organizations argued that punishments were excessive given provocation, while law enforcement organizations maintained that any leniency would send dangerous message that families could employ violence against officers performing duties. Samuel Dixon died in federal prison in 2010 at age 94. From natural causes, having served 46 years, Rachel Dixon remained imprisoned until death in 2019 at age 99. Michael Dixon was released in 2014 at age 83 after serving 50 years when elderly prisoner humanitarian considerations prompted clemency. Thomas Dixon had died in 1985 at age 93, had lived 22 years following collection operation, and had witnessed children and grandson imprisoned for avenging humiliation that he'd characterized as devastating attack on dignity and spiritual authority that elderly patriarch had no capacity for defending against when federal agents had employed overwhelming force to break standing within family and within religious community that his leadership had depended on maintaining. Family Bible had been returned to Dixon clan in 1965 following trial, book that had been held as evidence but that had been released when prosecution concluded, return that had been bittersweet when Bible's possession had motivated 21 deaths and 3 family members' life imprisonments, creating tragedy that sacred objects recovery couldn't reverse. The late 20th century brought renewed attention to Dixon case when investigative journalist Patricia Morrison obtained IRS files through Freedom of Information requests. Documents revealed that collection operation had been authorized not because Thomas was suspected of significant tax violations, but because IRS enforcement priorities during 1960s emphasized aggressive tactics that would demonstrate federal authority and deter populations from avoiding obligations. That supervisors had encouraged Webb to make examples of debtors through public demonstrations that would create fear-motivating compliance, regardless of whether specific tactics violated dignity or exceeded what professional standards required. Morrison published findings in 2011 book titled Mountain Reapers: How Humiliating Patriarch Over Poker Debt Created Poisoning Campaign, comprehensive examination documenting evangelical mountain culture. Thomas's standing as spiritual leader, collection operations degrading tactics, Bible confiscations religious significance, systematic poisoning campaign, trial and imprisonment. Most shocking discovery was documentation proving that IRS supervisors had received complaints about Webb's aggressive collection tactics during years before Dixon operation, that multiple families had reported being subjected to public humiliations and unnecessary property confiscations, that policies theoretically prohibited, but that enforcement culture had tolerated when aggressive approaches produced higher collection rates and when demonstrating federal authority was prioritized over maintaining respectful relationships with communities. Internal communications revealed that supervisors had characterized mountain populations as backwards religious fanatics whose dignity and whose cultural practices weren't deserving respect that enforcement in other contexts would have required. Attitude that had contributed to Webb's decision to force Thomas to kneel and to agents' casual confiscation of Bible when cultural sensitivity would have recognized that attacking patriarch's dignity and taking sacred objects would create grievances exceeding what simple debt collection represented. Documentary filmmaker Sarah Thompson produced comprehensive examination in 2018, film titled When Faith Met Federal Force, Dixon Clan's Poison Justice, featuring interviews with religious scholars, mountain culture anthropologists, Morrison discussing research findings, remaining Dixon family members expressing perspectives about whether systematic poisoning campaign had been justified response to Thomas's humiliation. Documentary presented balanced account, acknowledging both profound violation that forcing elderly patriarch to kneel before family represented in evangelical culture and 21 deaths affecting families regardless of deceased agents' individual degrees of culpability for humiliation or for Bible confiscation. Most powerful documentary segment featured interview with Martha Dixon, age 76 in 2018, Thomas's granddaughter, who'd been 12 years old when collection operation had occurred and who'd witnessed grandfather being forced to kneel in mud. Martha explained that watching federal agents make Grandpa kneel in mud and read statement calling himself degenerate gambler while we were all standing there, including little children, seeing man who'd been our spiritual leader and who we'd been taught to respect as godly elder reduced to position of begging forgiveness from government people. Then watching them take our family Bible that had records of every birth and death and marriage for 5 generations, destroyed our faith in system that supposedly protected religious freedom, made us understand that federal authority viewed our beliefs as jokes and viewed our sacred objects as property they could take for fun. Documentary's most controversial revelation came from interviews with families of some 21 killed agents. Interviews revealed complex perspectives, ranging from those who maintained that relatives had been murder victims, regardless of humiliation context, to those who acknowledged that deceased family members had participated in operation, that cultural insensitivity had characterized, and that Webb's tactics had been violations that supervisors should have prevented, but hadn't. Several families described how learning details about evangelical culture and about family Bible significance had changed understanding of case, explained that initial characterization of relatives as victims of unprovoked violence had evolved into recognition that institutional failures had created situation where family group had employed desperate measures, that Thomas's humiliation, while insufficient legal justification, had made psychologically comprehensible when religious context was properly understood. Federal government conducted review in 2019 examining IRS collection practices during 1960s-1970s period. Review identified patterns where agents had employed public humiliations and had confiscated property with cultural or religious significance, that policies prohibited taking when objects had no monetary value, making them unsuitable for satisfying debts. That training inadequately addressed how to conduct collections respectfully in culturally distinct communities, where dignity and religious practices were fundamental values requiring protection. Review concluded that reforms were necessary for preventing future incidents, where degrading tactics created grievances that evidence suggested were motivating violence against law enforcement. Federal legislation passed in 2020 established Thomas Dixon Dignity in Debt Collection Act, requiring federal agencies to implement training about conducting collections without employing public humiliations, about respecting religious objects and cultural practices when confiscating property, about understanding that tactics that might be acceptable in some contexts could be profoundly violating in communities where dignity and faith were paramount values. Legislation was named for Thomas, recognizing that his case had exposed institutional failures requiring reforms, that preventing similar tragedies required federal standards, ensuring that collection operations were conducted professionally without degrading debtors or attacking religious heritage. Historical marker installed at Dixon compound in 2021 reflected balanced approach. Dixon Clan 1963 systematically poisoned 21 federal agents following IRS collection operation, where Agent Marcus Webb forced Patriarch Thomas Dixon, age 71, to kneel in mud before family members while reading statement admitting he was degenerate gambler. Agents confiscated family Civil War Bible containing 5 generations of records despite book having no monetary value for $300 poker debt. 3 family members coordinated poisoning campaign using traditional medicine knowledge. Convicted after 16-day jury deliberation, served decades in prison. Case prompted federal reforms including Thomas Dixon Dignity in Debt Collection Act. This site reminds us that debt collection must respect human dignity, that attacking religious heritage creates grievances, that public humiliation, especially of elders, violates cultural values deserving protection. By 2024, Dixon case remained most studied example, examining intersection of religious freedom and debt collection enforcement, case studied in training about respecting cultural dignity and about understanding that tactics serving enforcement purposes in some contexts can be profoundly violating in communities where faith and elder respect are paramount. Modern religious freedom and mountain culture preservation movements invoke Dixon Clan as symbol of resistance to federal authority that systematically disrespected evangelical values, argue that systematic poisoning, while legally unjustifiable, represented assertion of dignity against authority, demonstrating contempt through forcing spiritual leader to perform degrading ritual that destroyed standing essential for religious communities functioning. Comparative analysis examining Dixon's 21 victims revealed complex picture, where Agent Webb had forced Thomas to kneel and had confiscated Bible, making him primary target, whose death no one disputed was intentional focus of campaign. 6 other agents had been directly involved in restraining Thomas during humiliation, creating complicity that poisoning campaign had treated as warranting death. 14 agents had been collection operation participants whose involvement had been peripheral, without directly forcing Thomas to kneel or without personally confiscating Bible, but whose presence during operation had made them targets when families' collective response hadn't distinguished between primary perpetrators and peripheral participants. This distribution raised questions that appeals had consistently argued whether killing 14 peripheral participants represented excessive response, even when acknowledging that Webb's tactics and 6 agents' direct participation had been violations deserving accountability. Michael Dixon's release in 2014 after 50 years imprisonment had been a controversial decision when some law enforcement organizations had opposed clemency, arguing that systematic murder of 21 officers deserved actual life imprisonment regardless of defendant's age, while civil liberties advocates had argued that elderly prisoner whose participation had likely been coerced through family dynamics and whose half-century of imprisonment had already exceeded punishments that many violent offenders received deserved humanitarian consideration. Michael's clemency had been conditioned on his agreeing to participate in federal law enforcement training programs discussing religious sensitivity and discussing how Dixon case exemplified consequences when operations disrespected communities' faith practices, participation that Michael had fulfilled through giving numerous presentations to IRS agents, explaining evangelical mountain culture, and explaining how Thomas's humiliation had been experienced by family as profound spiritual violation rather than as simple embarrassment that outsiders had characterized it as. Michael's presentations had been powerful educational tools because his personal experience and his willingness to acknowledge that poisoning campaign had been wrong while explaining religious context that had motivated violence provided perspectives that training instructors couldn't replicate, made real for officers what abstract discussions about religious sensitivity couldn't convey, about how collection tactics could create grievances that entire kinship groups might respond to through coordinated actions. Michael had explained in presentations that Grandpa Thomas wasn't just our family elder, he was our spiritual leader, who conducted services and who everyone in clan looked to for guidance about living righteously, forcing him to kneel in mud and read statement calling himself degenerate gambler, destroyed his standing as godly man, made little children who'd been taught to respect him see him humiliated by federal authority, taking our family Bible that had records of ancestors and that we'd used in worship for generations was like taking piece of our souls, made us understand that government viewed our faith as joke and viewed our sacred objects as things they could take for entertainment. Federal legislation establishing dignity and collection requirements had been implemented with mixed results. Department of Treasury reports examining compliance during 2021-2024 period revealed that while training about respecting dignity had been provided, cultural attitudes within some collection enforcement agencies continued prioritizing recovery rates over conducting operations respectfully, that tactics like public acknowledgements and property confiscations that no monetary value justified continued occurring when agents believed aggressive approaches would motivate faster payments. Implementation challenges that Dixon family advocates pointed to as demonstrating that systemic reforms required not just training, but changing cultures that historically had prioritized collection statistics through employing intimidation tactics that policies theoretically prohibited, but that supervisors tolerated when results were achieved. Contemporary debt collection training incorporating Dixon case emphasizes that respecting debtors' dignity serves practical function beyond abstract commitment to humane treatment, that employing public humiliations creates grievances affecting not only individual debtors, but entire family networks whose collective responses can be dangerous. That understanding religious contexts, where spiritual authority depends on maintaining respect, is necessary for conducting operations without destroying standing that communities depend on for functioning. Training materials cite specific example of forcing Thomas to kneel resulting in 21 deaths as demonstration that degrading elderly spiritual leaders creates cascading harms affecting officers and communities whose relationships depend on trust that federal authority will respect dignity even when collecting legitimate debts. International debt collection organizations examining cultural sensitivity standards frequently cite Dixon case as example from United States demonstrating consequences when officers lack understanding of communities where enforcement occurs, while noting that dignity violations and religious heritage attacks aren't unique to American context, but affect collection operations globally, where cultural practices and faith traditions create values that monetary frameworks inadequately capture, creating situations where collection agents from mainstream backgrounds may fail. Appreciating significance of objects or rituals that communities view as sacred, even when market value suggests they're worthless for satisfying debts. Scholars argue that Dixon case exemplifies universal principle that effective enforcement requires understanding what populations value and ensuring that operations don't gratuitously destroy dignity or attack religious practices that cultures consider fundamental to identity. By 2024, 61 years after poisoning campaign, descendants of some 21 killed agents had established Reconciliation Foundation with Dixon family members, foundation that had been initiated by Jennifer Webb, age 38, whose grandfather, Agent Marcus Webb, had forced Thomas to kneel and had confiscated Bible. Jennifer had contacted Dixon family members, explaining that understanding religious context of humiliation was necessary for her family to achieve closure about grandfather's death and about whether his collection tactics had been justified enforcement or had been degrading violations that policies prohibited. Dialogue had expanded to include other families on both sides, had resulted in joint memorial services where participants acknowledged complexity that simple narratives condemning systematic poisoning or defending dignity couldn't adequately capture. Reconciliation efforts had been controversial within both communities. Some agents' families maintained that dialogue with clan whose members had murdered relatives was inappropriate, regardless of Thomas's humiliation, argued that focus should remain on 21 deaths rather than on collection tactics that had motivated coordinated violence. Similarly, some Dixon family members opposed reconciliation, explaining that 3 family members had spent decades imprisoned and that 2 had died in prison. That engagement with agents' families suggested acceptance of legal systems' judgments, when actually they viewed prosecutions as unjust responses to defensive actions, protecting spiritual leaders' dignity after federal authority had destroyed religious standing and had confiscated sacred object. But participants in dialogue process emphasized that acknowledging all victims, including Thomas, whose humiliation had been documented, and 21 officers whose deaths had affected families, was necessary for honest examination of how institutional failures and religious dynamics had combined, creating tragedy affecting multiple generations. Modern scholarship examining Dixon case within broader context of religious freedom violations during federal enforcement has revealed that Thomas's humiliation represented pattern during 1960s, where law enforcement conducting operations in evangelical regions had employed tactics demonstrating contempt for populations whose faith practices differed from mainstream denominational Christianity. That collection and tax enforcement particularly had been characterized by aggressive approaches, treating mountain religious communities as backward populations deserving intimidation rather than as citizens whose First Amendment rights required respecting even when collecting legitimate debts. Comprehensive analyses examining 1960s federal enforcement in evangelical Appalachian regions have documented numerous incidents where agents had mocked religious practices, had confiscated Bibles and religious materials without justification, had employed public humiliations targeting spiritual leaders, creating resentments that Dixon violence, while extreme in its lethality, represented in terms of underlying grievances about federal authorities' systematic disrespect for religious freedom. What distinguished Dixon case from other religious freedom conflicts was combination of Thomas having exceptional standing as spiritual leader, whose dignity was essential for clan's religious functioning, family Bible containing irreplaceable 5-generation records, making its confiscation far more devastating than ordinary Bible seizure would have been, systematic poisoning campaign employing traditional medicine knowledge that demonstrated sophisticated application of botanical expertise to coordinated violence, successful elimination of entire target list before apprehension, trial raising unprecedented religious freedom questions that secular legal system had inadequately appreciated. Most religious freedom conflicts had involved property destruction or harassment without resulting in systematic murder campaigns, had been resolved through accepting violations rather than through employing violence that might have drawn attention to enforcement problems, but that legal systems would condemn as criminal regardless of provocations that had motivated desperate responses. Jennifer Webb's reconciliation work had been motivated partly by discovering through Morrison's research that her grandfather had history of employing degrading tactics during collections, that IRS had received complaints about Webb's methods, but had dismissed concerns because collection rates were high and because aggressive approaches were viewed as effective deterrents, regardless of whether tactics violated dignity or attacked religious practices. Revelation that had created questions about whether grandfather's humiliation of Thomas had been isolated incident or had represented pattern of behavior that supervisors should have addressed through discipline or additional training. Jennifer's conversations with Dixon family members had revealed that Thomas's humiliation, while triggering immediate poisoning campaign, had occurred within context of years of federal enforcement operations that evangelical families had experienced as systematic attacks on faith practices. That forcing spiritual leader to perform degrading ritual had been final violation in long series of grievances that had accumulated until collective response became inevitable when authorities had demonstrated through dismissing complaints that official channels wouldn't provide accountability for agents who destroyed what communities considered sacred. This broader context had become important in reconciliation dialogues because it explained why Dixon violence had been so systematic and had involved multiple family members rather than being spontaneous individual response, helped participants understand that while poisoning campaign couldn't be legally justified, it had represented culmination of institutional failures affecting not just Dixons, but entire evangelical mountain communities whose religious practices federal authority had been mocking, and whose spiritual leaders' agents had been humiliating through operations that demonstrated contempt rather than respect for populations being regulated. Understanding that Thomas's humiliation had been experienced not as isolated embarrassment, but as attack on clan's religious identity that spiritual authority depended on maintaining, helped agents' families comprehend why reaction had been so extreme, while understanding that 21 deaths had affected families, regardless of whether victims had forced Thomas to kneel or had confiscated Bible, helped Dixon descendants recognize that violence had created suffering exceeding what any provocation could justify. Contemporary debates about Dixon case reflected broader conflicts about limits of religious freedom when governments collect debts, about whether attacks on spiritual leaders' dignity can ever justify coordinated violence, even when legally criminal, about how societies should balance sympathy for religious grievances against condemnation of systematic murders, creating multiple victims. Annual memorial services organized by reconciliation participants attracted both supporters who viewed dialogue as path toward healing and critics who maintained that focus should remain on condemning poisonings rather than on examining contexts that might appear to justify campaign that had killed 21 people for $300 debt collection regardless of how degrading tactics had been. The enduring questions that Dixon case raises about appropriate debt collection methods when populations hold dignity sacred, about whether confiscating religious objects should ever be permitted when monetary value doesn't justify seizures, about how law enforcement should conduct operations in faith communities where spiritual authority depends on maintaining respect, about whether family groups should be held collectively responsible for members' coordinated violence when religious obligations create coercion. These remain unresolved 61 years after poisoning campaign, continue shaping debates about religious freedom in federal enforcement, about dignity protections, about evangelical mountain culture preservation. Annual memorial gatherings demonstrate that time alone doesn't resolve fundamental disagreements about moral responsibility, when institutions destroy spiritual standing and when families respond through systematic violence. That honest examination requires acknowledging both legitimate religious grievances about Thomas's humiliation and 21 deaths affecting officers' families, regardless of victims' degrees of participation in degrading ritual or in Bible confiscation. Modern religious freedom movements invoke Dixon case when advocating for stronger First Amendment protections during government operations, argue that current laws inadequately protect spiritual leaders from humiliation and inadequately prevent confiscation of sacred objects. That Thomas Dixon Dignity Act, while important, represents minimum standards that should be expanded to include civil penalties when officers unnecessarily degrade religious figures and to require independent investigations when sacred property seizures create complaints. Critics counter that emphasizing religious protections risks obscuring that 21 human deaths resulted from debt collection. That focus should remain on preventing violence rather than on expanding religious exemptions that might constrain government's ability to collect legitimate obligations, even when debtors claim faith practices excuse non-payment. Descendants of Dixon family, including Thomas's great-great-granddaughter Rebecca Dixon, age 41 in 2024, expressed nuanced perspectives about ancestors' systematic violence. Rebecca acknowledged that killing 21 people had created victims whose families had suffered regardless of whether deceased agents had forced Thomas to kneel or had confiscated Bible, but emphasized that understanding actions required recognizing religious context, where patriarch's dignity was essential for spiritual authority and where family Bible represented irreplaceable connection to ancestors that 5 generations of records made sacred beyond any monetary value. Rebecca's balanced position created some controversy within broader evangelical preservation community, where some argued that any acknowledgement of poisoning campaigns' excessiveness risked betraying ancestors' defense of faith, while others maintained that honest examination required recognizing that violence had exceeded what any provocation could justify when 14 peripheral collection. Participants who hadn't directly humiliated Thomas had been killed. Federal legislation establishing dignity protections prompted examination of broader patterns, where debt collection had historically employed public humiliations and had confiscated property with cultural significance. Department of Treasury analysis, examining approximately 700 incidents from 1960-2000 period, where collections had involved degrading tactics, identified systematic patterns where agents had forced debtors to make public acknowledgments, had confiscated religious objects or family heirlooms that no monetary value justified taking. That training had inadequately prepared collectors for understanding that tactics that might motivate payments could be profoundly violating in communities where dignity and sacred objects were paramount values. Analysis resulted in recommendations for comprehensive training about respectful collection methods, about cultural contexts where degradation creates grievances exceeding debt amounts, about prohibiting confiscation of objects whose cultural or religious significance made them unsuitable for satisfying financial obligations regardless of enforcement goals. Contemporary debt collection training, incorporating Dixon case, emphasizes that respecting dignity isn't merely about humane treatment, but serves practical function preventing violence. That understanding religious contexts, where spiritual authority depends on maintaining standing, is necessary for conducting operations without destroying leadership that communities depend on for functioning. That casual confiscation of sacred objects communicates contempt for populations undermining relationships that effective enforcement requires. Training materials cite Thomas's humiliation as demonstration that single agent's decision to force elderly spiritual leader to perform degrading ritual before family resulted in 21 deaths affecting law enforcement community throughout region. Cascading consequences that cultural sensitivity and dignity protections would have prevented if Webb had recognized that collection tactics appropriate in some contexts could be devastating violations in evangelical communities where elder respect and religious authority were fundamental values. By 2024, the preserved family Bible displayed at Tennessee Museum of Religious Heritage had become powerful educational tool. Actual book that Dixon family had donated in 2022 allowed visitors to see Civil War-era Bible, whose 5 generations of handwritten family records made it sacred object rather than mere book. Educational placards explained its significance in evangelical culture and explained how confiscation for $300 debt had been experienced as attack on Klan's spiritual identity. Museum exhibit included recordings from Thomas Dixon's interviews conducted in 1970s, where he'd explained that Bible wasn't just book to us, was record of every ancestor back to great-great-grandfather who'd carried it through war, had pressed flowers from funerals, and had prayers written in margins that grandmothers had penned, was thing we'd used in every worship service and every family gathering for generations. Having federal agents take it for poker debt that I was paying back gradually was like having them take our souls. Wasn't about money, although Bible was priceless to us, was about them showing contempt for our faith and for our ancestors whose records they were holding hostage. Museum's complimentary exhibit honored 21 killed agents, displayed photographs and biographical information about each victim, included statements from families describing losses and describing perspectives about whether relatives' deaths had been preventable if religious sensitivity had been prioritized, or whether deaths represented inevitable consequences when enforcement operations entered evangelical regions, where faith practices were fundamental to identity. Balanced presentation that refused simplifying story into narrative, celebrating Dixon resistance or condemning poisoning violence, acknowledged complexity, requiring visitors to grapple with competing values about religious freedom, about debt collection legitimacy, about dignity protections, about limits of justifiable retaliation when spiritual standing is destroyed. Rebecca Dixon's advocacy work, following her participation in reconciliation dialogues, had focused on promoting understanding between evangelical communities and federal enforcement agencies. She'd developed training programs used by IRS and other collection services, explaining mountain religious culture and explaining how specific tactics could be modified to collect debts effectively without degrading debtors or attacking faith practices. Rebecca had emphasized in trainings that evangelical mountain people aren't backward fanatics who use religion to avoid obligations. We're citizens whose faith is central to identity and whose spiritual leaders maintain authority through dignity that public humiliation destroys when debt collectors come forcing elders to perform degrading rituals and taking sacred objects for debts that are being repaid. Operations create resentments that can explode into violence when specific incidents like Grandpa's humiliation represent final violations in long series of grievances that have accumulated through years of disrespectful enforcement, treating our religious practices as jokes. Until next time, remember that Dixon clan poisoned 21 federal agents using traditional medicine knowledge after Agent Marcus Webb forced 71-year-old patriarch Thomas Dixon to kneel in mud before family members while reading statement calling himself degenerate gambler who couldn't pay honest debts. That agent's confiscated family Civil War Bible containing 5 generations of records, despite book having no monetary value for satisfying $300 poker debt that Thomas was repaying gradually, that 3 family members coordinated systematic poisoning campaign employing deadly nightshade, aconite, arsenic, cyanide, and ricin that botanical expertise enabled administering through food and drink, that 16-day jury deliberation examined religious significance of spiritual leaders' dignity before convicting all defendants. That case prompted federal reforms establishing Thomas Dixon Dignity in Debt Collection Act, requiring respectful collection methods, and that ultimately debt collection must respect human dignity, especially when debtors are spiritual leaders, whose standing is essential for religious communities functioning. That confiscating sacred objects serving no collection purpose communicates contempt that undermines enforcement legitimacy and that can motivate coordinated responses employing knowledge that traditional medicine practices teach. That cultural sensitivity requires appreciating that tactics serving enforcement purposes in some contexts can be profoundly violating in communities where faith and elder respect are paramount values deserving protection even when collecting legitimate obligations. That institutional failures dismissing complaints about degrading tactics demonstrate to evangelical populations that official channels won't provide accountability, requiring desperate measures that legal systems condemn, but that religious frameworks view as necessary defenses of spiritual authority when federal operations systematically destroy dignity that believers consider essential for godly living and that elders require for maintaining leadership that communities depend on for religious guidance and moral instruction. The broader implications of Dixon case extended beyond individual tragedy, when modern researchers examining religious freedom violations during federal enforcement discovered that Thomas's humiliation had represented broader pattern during 1960s-1970s, where evangelical communities had been experiencing systematic attacks on faith practices through operations that agents had conducted with contempt. For populations whose religious expressions differed from mainstream denominational Christianity, that debt collection and tax enforcement particularly had targeted spiritual leaders through degrading tactics designed to break authority that religious communities depended on for moral guidance and spiritual instruction. Comprehensive studies examining evangelical resistance to federal authority during this period revealed dozens of incidents where operations had destroyed religious standing through public humiliations, had confiscated sacred objects without justification, had mocked faith practices that populations considered fundamental to salvation and to proper living, creating accumulated grievances that occasionally exploded into violence. When specific incidents represented final violations that communities couldn't accept without defending spiritual heritage, that federal authority was systematically attacking through enforcement methods that cultural insensitivity and institutional prejudices against evangelical mountain religion had made seem acceptable to agents whose mainstream denominational backgrounds or secular worldviews prevented them from appreciating that dignity and sacred objects were values exceeding monetary considerations that collection operations prioritized. What Dixon violence demonstrated most fundamentally was that when governmental authority treats religious dignity as expendable in pursuit of collecting relatively minor debts, when sacred objects are confiscated serving no legitimate purpose beyond demonstrating power, when spiritual leaders are forced to perform degrading rituals before communities whose faith depends on maintaining elders' standing, then families will defend religious heritage through coordinated responses, employing whatever knowledge traditional practices have taught. That botanical expertise developed through generations of traditional medicine would be weaponized when federal operations attacked fundamental values that evangelical mountain culture considered worth defending through violence, that legal prohibitions couldn't deter when alternative was accepting, that spiritual authority could be destroyed casually by agents whose cultural insensitivity made them unable to appreciate that $300 debt collection had become an attack on religious identity that entire clan would risk everything to avenge.